Hello and welcome to Alive and Composing the Wonderful World of Innova with Zack Browning. Please state your name for the record, Zack.
Zack Browning.
Very good. And that has a K in it somewhere, right?
Pardon?
That Zack has a K in it. A lot of Zacks don't have Ks.
Yeah, my real name is Zachary, and I use it as Zack, Z-A-C-K.
Okay. Now, we are doing a longitudinal study here of Innova composers and the pets that they have. Do you have a household pet? If so, does it have an interesting name?
Well, I did have a dog for 16 years, up until last March. Name was Lucy, Shih Tzu.
Okay, and does Lucy relate to kind of any operatic heroine or anything artistic or creative that we can think of?
I love Lucy. It was my daughter's favorite television show.
That explains everything.
But she acted like Lucifer, though, unfortunately.
That explains the other side of your compositions.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. After a hard day at the Magic Squares and teaching students, how do you like to spoil yourself? Do you have any interesting habits?
Yeah, I guess so. For many years, I coached soccer, and I still referee soccer.
Is there anything about either the physical activity that you get involved with or the logistics of the soccer team that relate to your compositional thinking?
Of course, soccer is the most creative game there is. It's all about creating space, which to me is what's very important about creating rhythm in music is how do you create space for letting these things happen. So soccer is that on the fly, you must be able to create space.
Now, are you like the team captain, as it were the composer, or are you one of the minions protecting a goal or something?
Now you're talking about refereeing. As a referee, I'm like a conductor. So, for many years you wore black. You don't have to wear black anymore, but it's very much like conducting.
Interesting. I never thought of it that way. American football, yes, but my accent comes from soccer land. Now, if you weren't making music as a career, what might you have ended up doing?
Wow, that's a good question. I guess my interest in Magic Squares, maybe I'd become a feng shui expert. Who knows?
Okay, is there anything about the background we should know vis-a-vis your feng shui interest?
Oh, well, that's just developed really in the last 10 years, I guess. I became interested in Magic Squares around 1984, and that led me to do several pieces with Magic Squares, and then I became interested in feng shui. Like I said, about 8-10 years ago.
Okay, you've mentioned these strange magic squares. Tell us about magic squares.
Magic squares, very simple, sort of like a crossword puzzle, where you get a word this way and a word that way. That is, a magic square, the horizontal, the vertical, and the diagonals all add up to the same number. So you're able to use different routes, I call them, or paths through the square. I like to use the word route, that add up to the same number.
And does this relate to some of the other historical serial techniques of working your way through a matrix and how rows go backwards and forwards and all of that?
Well, more interesting than that, though, it's more about like what the Chinese use numbers for. That is, they use numbers to explain the unexplainable. And so whenever I go out and do lectures on this, I always get that kind of question, this is all about serialism. No, it's not about serialism. It's a much bigger concept of numbers. But there were certain magic squares that were assigned the planets. They're called the Planetary Squares, and they're very interesting. And those are the ones I've centered on. Myself and Peter Maxwell Davies is certainly a composer since 1975, has been using planetary squares.
Right, I know, like a mirror of whitening light relates to some of the alchemical magic squares that he used from, I think, the Western tradition. And isn't there also like Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus or Hesse's Glass Bead Game that refer to those?
Yeah, there are a few composers dabbling in this, I believe Steve Everett is one person, a good friend of mine from the old days, that actually interested me in magic squares after he studied with Peter Maxwell Davies.
Now, just because you and Max both use magic squares doesn't mean your music sounds like each other at all.
I can give you a quick comparison and difference there. Peter Maxwell Davies, when he does use magic squares, he uses the squares to generate music. I use the squares to give structure. So in Davies' music, it's very difficult or not impossible to hear a route through the square. Whereas in my music, it's constructed so that you can hear routes through the square.
Is this like like arranging blocks or larger units of music somehow that allow you to make those pathways? I'm also thinking of some of the early Peter Greenaway film techniques that used squares in that same kind of way, but visually.
Right, that's exactly right. For me, there's a skeleton structure in the background that keeps repeating, and I'm able to put different kinds of music in the foreground, but in the background, these numbers keep adding up to the same number, so that skeleton of the structure keeps repeating in the background.
All right, so that's why you can have this kind of rhythmic, propulsive, and body feeling, and everything kind of groovy without getting bogged down in the kind of moment form of a square sometimes.
That's correct. And when you mention the feeling of rhythm and the groove, let's say, that's always interesting because recently I've been lucky enough to have performances in Asia, and use the word groove, and they don't know what that means.
But because it's such an alien tradition in terms of...
Well, I mean, ask yourself, when if somebody asks you, what does groove mean? You have to define that. And I find that it helps my music, actually, to have to define that precisely. And what a groove is when more than one musician, two or more musicians, are sharing the same rhythm and the same feel for that rhythm down to the micro units of that rhythm. They're tuned in that closely together. Therefore, then you have a groove.
And where did the groove come from in your life? Was there a moment, are you habitually tapping your foot and you just figured out the music?
I don't know if it was that, but I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and Augusta was the birthplace of James Brown. So I went to many James Brown concerts in Atlanta, and I still am a fan of James Brown. So somewhere in my music, there's something there. I've been thinking about it. Who knows if I'll get to do it, but I want to do an opera on James Brown. That's what I want to do.
Cool. Now, tell us about how your habitat has affected your music and your career, because you come from the very, very flat fields of Illinois, right?
That's true. Moving here from Atlanta, that was sort of a culture shock. But after I found out how to live here, how to communicate, how to use the school to your advantage, there's a terrific group of composers that have gone through this place, grad students still here. So the feedback you get is tremendous. So I've been actually very lucky to be here, and it's influenced my music in a positive way. Any direction you take is greatly supported here. In fact, some people see that as our weakness. That's our strength, the diversity of composition here.
Right, for 50 years, Champaign-Urbana has been a really important campus for that. And what have you learned from your students and from your fellow faculty? Is that something that you can absorb and run with and evolve with, or do you find yourself carving out a particular niche and sticking to it?
Well, no, I think I'm developing as a composer, and I think we all need to, or our music's not alive. But one thing I learned, you asked me what I learned, Herbert Broom was a composer here. He died some 10 years ago. And his definition of a composer has always been in my thoughts, and it's a challenge. And that is, a composer is a person who writes music that makes themselves necessary. And so that is the challenge of every composer right there.
Absolutely. Yeah, he was a very great man for epithets and everything else. Mm-hmm. And do you have any kind of moments in your life that were the life-changing ones? You mentioned James Brown, but can you think back to, the moment when you absolutely knew that music had to be in your life, or that you saw a work of art, or you read a poem, or you walked into a room and some work of art really kind of blew your mind at that moment?
There are mixtures of things. There was this program called My Three Sons, and the youngest son started playing trumpet. And I have two older brothers, so I told my parents I had to play trumpet. And so after that moment, I played for 40 straight years. Played 1 year Atlanta Symphony, and I was very legit on trumpet. Everything was classically trained. And then I taught myself how to play jazz piano. So for many years, I kept those separate. And I'll never forget, there was a percussionist who lived in my basement for about a month, and we did an improvisation. And as we started this improvisation of all these instruments he had brought back from India, I started to jump on the piano and improvise. He said, "No, you're going to use the trumpet." And that experience over the course of a month It's recorded. It's called A Conda is the name of that work. Of course, that month, it brought the two worlds together for me. And that was a big moment, actually, for me. Another big one is I got to study with Krzysztof Penderecki at Florida State. And that had a big influence on me for several years. Right after that, I was writing these large sound mask compositions. But, that was a very important experience to see that the professionalism of a composer. I played trumpet in the orchestra under him. I studied with him, so I got a big dose of that. The other one's important in my life, one more, is Salvatore Martirano was one of my teachers, and I actually have started, and it still goes on now, in the 17th year, the Martirano Composition Award, of which I serve as a director. Sal was a person, there's not many out there that can do real-time improvisation with electronic instrument. He was amazing in that regard. So creativity, that's what I learned from Sal.
You mentioned Herbert's definition of a composer being necessary. How does your art make a difference in the world? How is your voice contributing something? What do you hope for it to do to humanity?
Well, your timing's pretty good. 2 days ago, I just finished a project for two pianos, my response to Sandy Hook. And that's been a really difficult chore, actually. The piece itself has parts of the Catholic Mass in Paradisum, but it also has John Mayer, I believe it is John Mayer, Waiting for the World to Change, and Why Can't We Live Together, Timothy Thomas. And also it has all the birthdays from the victims were used to structure the piece using feng shui. So a piece like that, I definitely want to show how we share the sorrow and we respect what happened, but we also want to move towards change, and that there is this chance of hope, and that's what we got to jump on right now.
Right. Let's move on to your not one but two innova releases, both incredibly wonderful and propulsive and everything else. One Secret Pulse and one Venus Notorious. Do you want to give us the stories of those and maybe highlight
Sure.
a couple of tracks?
Yeah, well, we have to give credit to Innova for doing such a great job of releasing those, and so thank you for that. Yeah, I'm very fortunate, again, at the university to have great musicians. Now, I mean, we mentioned composers, but there's great musicians here. So Venus Notorious used primarily musicians from University of Illinois to put that together. The other CD, Secret Pulse, the most recent one, I was very fortunate to have the Jack Quartet, played by string quartet, and Cadillac Moon Ensemble, a young group in New York, which is a great group, and also a group in University of Central Florida, their percussion ensemble, Thad Anderson, sorry, not Thad Jones, Thad Anderson, and those groups, those are just great groups. And also from Taiwan, Ensemble Unity. So I've been very fortunate to get together with excellent musicians.
Yeah, and were these assemblages of pieces you just happened to have in the can and up your sleeve, or did you conceive of them as albums, or just decided to put them together?
I don't know. I haven't looked at my sleeve lately. You got any pieces up your sleeve? I wish that was the case. No, there's a lot of hard work, sweat and tears there, you know. Haka Fusion on the Secret Pulse CD, I believe, yeah? Or is that on the... No, that's on the... my bad. I believe it's on the other CD, yeah?
Haka Fusion is on Secret Pulse.
Oh, I'm right. Good. Sorry. Haka Fusion. That was a work that was commissioned... Most of these are commissions. That was commissioned by a group in Taiwan. And they asked for a piece that dealt with the Hakka group, which is a minority of the Chinese. And so they asked for a folk song in that piece. And so I was able to combine their birthdays with this Hakka folk song to make that piece. String Quartet was written for the Jack Quartet, you know. So all those they're all commissions there.
And even though we've discussed the magic square and the kind of structural loops you throw yourself through, you're still able to incorporate references to other kinds of music and quotations.
Yeah, one of the best reviews, at least for me, that struck home with me. Someone said recently about my saxophone quartet that it was like James Brown meets world music, and so that I like that very much. Yeah, one of the things I found when I was doing, my music was changing, and it's gotten the sections of it that are much more emotional, perhaps, than they used to be. It must be. Up until recently, it was mostly about power, you know, this kind of rock power in your face kind of, and it's become a little bit more a combination of emotional and this power side to it. So the emotional side, it enables me to bring in other kinds of music, which I mentioned the new piece I'm doing. It's called Vibrations of Hope for 2 piano. My response to San Diego. That piece has all those things in it that I mentioned, you know, and it's able to work together because the square allows it to happen. That's what I found, that the square can be inclusive. It's very good.
Well, it sounds like The Matrix. They should make a movie of that. But
Yes.
you also mentioned the feng shui. Tell me just a little bit more detail about that. I mean, we know it in terms of how you feel in a room and how the chi flows from one space to the next, and how you inhabit a space. How do you think of that musically?
Well, you know, your description is very simple, and I respect that, but it's very complicated. I went to China twice with I was envisioning that I was going to find out so much about feng shui, and I had an interpreter and everything, and the interpreter couldn't even handle it. I mean, that's why they have professionals. It's a way of living, of dedicating one's life to receiving the energy, not just moving the furniture around. So what it is that you can take these numbers, take the birth dates and the birth, or the date your house has been renovated, or the date it was born, the dates of other things that then affect your life, and superimpose all these dates according to how the structure, the square rotates. It's called a Lo-Shu square. And that rotation then gets superimposed, so the numbers are always changing. And they can then be evaluated or made into music, however you want to use it.
Great. Well, whether we understand it or not, your music is a beautiful space to inhabit.
Yeah, you don't have to understand that from it. Exactly, you do not. You know what it does? It allows me not to write pop music. It allows me to like music that Zack Browning likes. That's what the square is about. It is necessary for that. Back to that word, necessary.
It also seems to be a strategy for getting beyond your own preferences, as Kenneth Gaburo used to talk about.
That's correct. Kenneth Burrow has great connections to the U of I also.
Okay, well, we're listening to your music in the background right now, and we thank you very much for talking with us today, Zack.
Thank you, Philip.